In this video, we'll look at implementing code splitting and suspense when working with React Router. We'll once again use the lazy function and the suspense component, and we'll also briefly discuss the loadable components package. Let's begin. In the previous video, we implemented code splitting using dynamic imports and the react.lazy function. We also used the suspense component to render a fallback while the component code loads up. When working with React Router, every component that has to render on a given route is bundled into the main application because we use standard import statements. Even if you don't visit a route, your component code is still there in your browser. As you can guess, this isn't a great idea, especially for an evolving application. The great thing, however, is that we can implement code splitting and lazy loading components easily with React Router. This process will ensure that your initially loading code bundle is small, which immediately translates to faster load times. The process is exactly the same as we saw in the last video. Let's quickly run through a modified version of the app that we saw in the previous video to understand the process. Begin by downloading and setting up the project from the link given on the screen and bring up the development server as always. Here we have almost the same application as we saw in the previous video with one tiny change. We have integrated React Router already, and the photos and posts components now show up on their own routes. To implement code splitting and lazy loading with suspense, we'll basically repeat the same thing as we did in the previous video. We'll bring in the lazy function and the suspense component first. Then we'll use the lazy function to delay importing the components until such time they are required to render, which in this case would be when a user visits a route. Within the route components, you can then implement the suspense component, and we'll once again bring in the spinner component as a fallback. This works well, and we can again use our slow load function to artificially delay loading modules purely as a simulation to demonstrate the fallback UI. Looks perfect. The component is loaded only when you visit a route. And let's also create our production build. These stats on the console clearly show chunk numbers 3 and 4 for our photos and posts components respectively. So code splitting, lazy loading, and suspense are all working beautifully with React Router straight out of the box. Besides React's built-in lazy and suspense, you also have a third-party solution to implement code splitting and lazy loading. The loadable components library used to be the go-to solution for code splitting and lazy loading components before React.lazy and suspense got into the picture. But this library is relevant even today because it supports lazy loading components without suspense if the need be, and even server-side rendering, a technique for pre-rendering React apps on the server before they are downloaded and rendered on the client, besides several other features. Using loadable components is fairly straightforward. I'm back where I left off previously, and we'll begin by downloading and installing loadable like so. Once again, we can import the lazy function from the loadable library, and this would seamlessly replace the lazy function we get from React. On the other hand, you can also import loadable and use that instead of lazy. The benefit here is that this lets you use components without the suspense component if you wish to. It should be noted that React's own lazy function requires you to use the suspense component, whereas the loadable function doesn't enforce such a requirement. And anything you import using the loadable library is automatically marked for code splitting when you produce a production build. So overall, code splitting is an important step in optimizing your React app, and it aims to improve user experience at the end. React's built-in lazy function coupled with the suspense component can be easily used with the React router, and this splits your components into their own asynchronous chunks that are loaded only when needed. Additionally, the loadable components library, a third-party solution with several added features, may be used instead for the same purpose. This library offers a richer feature set than React's own lazy and suspense, and is particularly useful when server-side rendering and lazy loading of third-party modules such as the UUID or Lodash libraries is concerned. Overall, when working on a large application, code splitting and lazy loading should be integral to the feature set right from the beginning.